Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable. Sleep. Or more accurately, the medieval version of it, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. Picture it. No electricity, no alarm clock, no TikTok scroll to wind down the brain. Just the thick velvet of night pressing in through drafty windows, the scent of wood smoke, hay, and maybe one or two goats nearby who aren't strictly invited, but, it's cold. You lie down on something vaguely resembling a bed and close your eyes. But sleep doesn't come in the clean, 8-hour block you're used to. Nope. Medieval sleep was broken into 2 separate chunks, with a little nighttime intermission right in the middle. You doze off shortly after sundown, say around 8 p.m., and then after 4 hours your eyes pop open as though someone rang an invisible bell. Not from insomnia, not from nightmares, but because your body was supposed to. Welcome to the curious, slightly spooky world of segmented sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie there in the quiet, your eyes flutter open, and for a moment, you're not even surprised. The fire's a low glow, the room is chilly again, and someone else in the shared bed just rolled over and started snoring into your hair. Welcome to the watch, the hour or two in the middle of the night, when medieval folks did just about anything but sleep. You might poke at the fire, mend a torn sleeve, say a few whispered prayers, or shuffle out to check on the animals. If you're particularly devout or married, you might use this time for intimacy. Yes, that was considered entirely normal, even recommended. According to marriage manuals of the day, it was the best moment. Body rested, mind calm, and everyone too sleepy to argue. Charming, really. This was not some quirky outlier behavior. It was how sleep worked. Everyone from field hands to friars to noble ladies in velvet-lined beds followed this rhythm. Even writers like Geoffrey Chaucer casually reference it. If you were caught wandering the house at 2 a.m., no one asked what was wrong. You were just having your first waking. And here's the strange part. Modern science says this might actually be our natural sleep pattern. Studies on circadian rhythms and sleep cycles show that without artificial light, humans tend to fall asleep in 2 distinct phases, separated by a period of gentle wakefulness. It's like your brain's built-in commercial break. So when you're wide awake at 3 a.m. now, doom scrolling or wondering why your neighbor's baby has been crying since the 13th century, you're not broken. You're just accidentally living like a medieval peasant. Of course, back then, this middle-of-the-night hour wasn't wasted. It was productive in its own strange way. You'd stir the ashes in the hearth, perhaps recite some psalms or write, if you were among the lucky few who could. In some noble houses, this was a time for quiet conversation. Picture 2 sisters in linen caps whispering gossip by candlelight while trying not to wake the rest of the family. Cozy. Unless the family dog has taken your blanket again. For monks and nuns, however, this watch period was spiritual business. Many religious orders scheduled matins, their nighttime prayer service, precisely during this sleepy interval. Picture being shaken awake by a somber bell, pulling on your robe and trudging through stone corridors barefoot, breath misting in the air to chant in a freezing chapel. Peaceful? Sure, but mostly cold and sleep-deprived. Now, to be fair, not everyone loved segmented sleep. Some grumbled about the interruption. Others embraced it as a gift, a time of private thoughts, dreams half-remembered, or divine inspiration. Historians still argue whether people genuinely enjoyed this midnight pause, or just accepted it the way we now accept morning traffic. Unpleasant, but inevitable. But one thing's for certain. The Industrial Revolution killed it. As gaslighting, factory shifts, and rigid work schedules swept across Europe, the once natural two-part sleep became an inconvenience. Doctors began promoting 8 uninterrupted hours of rest as the new health standard. Segmented sleep was suddenly rebranded as disorder. The vibe went from normal village rhythm to have you tried chamomile tea and mindfulness? Still, echoes of it remain. Ever wake up at 3 a.m. with a random surge of clarity? Feel like you could write a novel or suddenly solve your life? That's the ghost of first sleep whispering. And next time it happens, don't panic. Just smile, stretch, and say to yourself, "Ah yes, the watch has begun." Then tend your imaginary hearth, or maybe actually go make that tea. Because in the medieval world, the night wasn't a solid, quiet block. It was alive, flickering, strangely social, and surprisingly busy. And if you're lucky, or just a little weird, you might find that your own restless nights connect you with centuries of dreamers, thinkers, and goat checkers from long ago. You're sitting up now, on a scratchy straw-stuffed mattress, blinking into the dim light of a low fire, or maybe just the moonlight squeezing through an animal horn-covered window. You've just emerged from your first sleep, and instead of wondering why your body woke you up, you're doing exactly what you're supposed to. Embracing the medieval watch. No one calls this insomnia. There's no doctor to sigh about circadian misalignment. You're not broken, you're just in intermission. A built-in interval of gentle awareness that made up the very architecture of a medieval night. So, what do? First, you pray. Not in a panicked, end-of-rope sort of way, but with sleepy fingers counting rosary beads or reciting half-remembered psalms. Prayer was the background music of the medieval night. It helped ward off demons, diseases, and, most terrifying of all, spiritual disarray. You might sit on the edge of your bedding, whispering the same verses your grandmother used to chant. If you were literate and devout, perhaps you opened a worn book of hours and squinted by candlelight. This was the prime hour for devotion when the world was quiet, the soul was exposed, and your bladder wasn't quite bothering you yet. Others tended to their homes. Fires were checked, especially in colder months. An untended hearth could mean a frozen family by morning or worse. A smoldering ember that quietly licked its way across the floor until everything was ash. So up you go, poke the coals, maybe add a log if you can spare one. If you're lucky, the dog hasn't stolen your best piece of firewood again. Livestock inspections were common too. People would shuffle outside in the darkness to make sure the goat hadn't wandered off, that the chickens hadn't decided to stage a revolt, and that no wolves were casing the yard like furry burglars. Because, yes, nothing says sleep hygiene, like wondering if your only milk source is being eyeballed by a hungry forest. But this watch wasn't all chores and psalms. It was oddly a social time. You're not alone in your wakefulness. Somewhere in the house, someone else is sitting up stretching, maybe telling a quiet story to a younger sibling, or soothing a child from a bad dream. Maybe your cousin rolls over and starts telling you what Uncle Piers said at supper, even though he snored through most of it. In noble households, servants might rise during this window to refill pitchers, arrange linens, or empty chamber pots, activities best done while the masters were unconscious. Ironically, that made the middle of the night a flurry of silent, half-lit motion. And then there's intimacy. Yes, this was the recommended time for sex. Medieval medical texts and marital guides specifically advised couples to be physically affectionate during the watch period. Why? Because after first sleep the body had cooled, the mind was unburdened, and your partner wasn't yet back in deep sleep where they might, flail or start snoring Latin. It was, they claimed, the most spiritually aligned and biologically convenient moment. Sweet, right? A time when love and sleep overlapped, like two halves of a broken biscuit. Of course, this wasn't all consensual or romantic. In some darker corners of medieval law and lore, this period of half-sleep vulnerability raised concerns about unwanted touch, supernatural visitation, or even demonic seduction. There were, believe it or not, sermons warning against midnight lust, and priests who recommended extra prayers after intimacy just to be safe. Because God apparently was also up during the watch. This entire interlude was so normalized, people rarely commented on it. The idea that sleep should be continuous would have seemed strange. In fact, if someone didn't wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, they might worry something was off. Too much wine, they'd mutter. Or, the devil has pacified him, which is possibly the medieval version of, he sleeps like a rock. Historians still argue whether this waking period was universal or regional. Was it more common in Northern Europe where nights were long? Did the urban elite do it differently than rural farmers? Were monks just dragging everyone into this lifestyle by ringing bells at unholy hours? There's no consensus, but the evidence for the practice is astonishingly widespread, from personal letters to religious manuscripts to old farming manuals that casually list the watch as prime time for sharpening tools. And even more fascinating, when early sleep scientists deprived modern people of electricity and let them follow natural light cycles, this pattern came back. Without artificial lighting to delay bedtime, subjects fell asleep earlier, woke up in the middle of the night for an hour or two, then drifted into second sleep naturally. They didn't panic. They just rested, reflected, maybe journaled. No blue light, no scrolling. Just the original bedtime routine, hidden in our brains like an old song waiting to be sung. So the next time you sit up in the dark and wonder why you're wide awake at 2:47 a.m., don't reach for melatonin. Maybe don't even reach for your phone. Just lean back into the watch. Light a candle if you have one, though maybe skip the goats. Open a window and breathe in the night. Think of peasants, monks, nobles, and insomniac chickens, all sharing the same pause in time across centuries. The night, after all, wasn't built to be silent. It was built to breathe. The hour grows late again, or rather late for the medieval clock, which doesn't tick so much as drips slowly with whacks and whispers. You've stirred the coals, prayed the prayers, maybe grumbled about the damp draft making its usual assault on your knees. But now, the second sleep calls, and you don't fight it. Unlike today's anxious tossing and turning, wondering whether to doom scroll or meditate, second sleep comes gently. It's like sinking into a different phase of night, a softer, deeper kind of rest. You don't set an alarm, obviously the rooster will do that, or the bells, or your neighbor's cow having a midnight meltdown. But for now, your body slips back into stillness without resistance. In this second sleep, that mysterious, ancient return to slumber, you enter what modern researchers call the REM-rich cycle. Medieval people didn't know the term, of course, but they understood the feeling. This sleep was dream-heavy, longer, sometimes filled with more vivid visions than the first. If first sleep was about rest, second sleep was for wandering. Through dreams, through memory, maybe even through the astral plane if you were that kind of sleeper. The average medieval person might sleep this way until just before sunrise. That meant a good 4 hours of first sleep, a 1 to 2 hour watch, and another 3 to 4 hours of deep second sleep. And here's the thing. Everyone did this. Monks, midwives, nobles, field workers. It wasn't a sleep disorder. It was the standard. By the time you wake again, dawn is scraping its gray fingernails across the edge of the thatched roof. Maybe the chickens are already complaining. You rise slowly, shaking off that heavy dream where you were being chased by a 7-headed goose or confessing sins to a talking wheelbarrow. Medieval dreams didn't come with logic. They came with layers. Your limbs creak. The fire's mostly gone. A family member coughs on the other side of the room. Somewhere a neighbor is already walking to the well. And here's the weird part. You feel rested. Not bright-eyed and chipper, mind you. No medieval person woke up feeling #blessed. But with segmented sleep, your body got what it needed. A mix of slow wave and REM, broken only by a purposeful pause. It was, in its own strange way, a sustainable rhythm. And without electric light, Netflix, or caffeine dependency, people simply let sleep do what sleep wanted. This was reflected in language too. Texts from the period casually reference first sleep and second sleep as common terms. One 13th century medical book lists troubles of the watch alongside fevers and gout. Another describes how dreams in the second sleep are more likely to be prophetic since the soul is loosened from the flesh. Creepy? Maybe. But elegant in a very candlelit kind of way. There's also something delightfully rebellious about this routine when viewed from a modern perspective. We're so obsessed with the perfect sleep hygiene checklist: bedtime alarms, blackout curtains, white noise apps, magnesium supplements, and the ever-silent shame of not sleeping through the night. But medieval folks, they just shrugged, stood up, and did stuff, and no one called it failure. That's perhaps the most comforting piece of all. Waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a sign of anxiety or spiritual malfunction. It was just part of being alive. You get up, you do your little tasks, maybe warm your hands by the hearth or gossip with your sister, and then you go back down like a sleepy haystack. Some medical scholars in the Middle Ages even recommended second sleep as better than the first. More healing, more peaceful, more divinely favored. It was in this later stretch that saints were said to appear in dreams, that certain herbs worked best when consumed upon rising, and that messages from God, or possibly a mischievous imp, were easier to decipher. And because everyone expected this rhythm, social life was shaped around it. Markets opened later in the morning. Work didn't always begin at sunrise. Meals were spaced differently. Even church services, those inescapable timestamps of the medieval world, adjusted around the reality that most people would only truly be functional after second sleep and a bit of porridge. But the most poignant detail? Children were taught this rhythm too. Parents expected little ones to stir during the night. They were told to be quiet, to sit up and pray if frightened, to listen for angels rather than monsters. Some parents made up gentle bedtime rhymes that ended not with good night, but see you after the waking. It was an acceptance of the night as a layered experience, not a single stretch of oblivion. Imagine the implications if we brought that mindset back. No more panicked Googling at 3 a.m. No more, oh no, I'll be wrecked tomorrow. Just a calm acknowledgement that your body is ancient, and it remembers a time when nights had two parts, two moods, two purposes. In that world, sleep wasn't something to conquer or optimize. It was a journey with a rest stop in the middle. And the second leg, second sleep, was the part where your mind, your soul, your dreams could roam more freely. So, as the rooster crows and the light filters in through warped wood and morning mist, you stretch. You yawn. You thank God, literally, that you woke. Because not everyone did. And now, it's time to begin the rest of your day. Tired maybe, but never surprised that sleep came in waves, not walls. Because for a medieval sleeper, the night didn't break you. You were meant to break it. Now that you've rejoined the world after second sleep, knees cracking, hair flattened, in a direction that defies physics, it's time to talk about where you spent those fragmented hours. The bed, or rather the medieval approximation of one. Let's be honest. If you've ever complained about a lumpy mattress, too firm hotel foam, or that one pillow that always tries to kill your neck in your sleep, you might want to sit down. Because in the medieval world, a bed was less sleep number, more crunchy floor pile with optional vermin. If you're a peasant, and most people were, you're sleeping on a pallet, which is not as luxurious as it sounds. In fact, it's basically a sack stuffed with straw or hay. And if you can't afford the sack part, congratulations, it's just the straw, directly on the ground, possibly damp. Certainly pokey. The straw was stuffed into rough canvas if you were lucky, or old linen scraps if you were very lucky. Either way, by week 2, that straw would begin to compress, mold, and attract company. And by company, we mean fleas and lice and field mice. Sometimes beetles. Possibly the neighbor's cat. Maybe the neighbor. Now, to be fair, straw was chosen for practical reasons. It was cheap, easily replaced, and pretty good at insulating against cold stone floors. But let's not romanticize it. Imagine trying to fall asleep on a crinkly salad while something with 6 legs scuttles near your ear. That's a medieval night. Still, this was the norm for poor families. And it wasn't just you on the straw pile, it was probably your entire household. Parents, kids, maybe a grandparent, and the occasional guest, all curled together like a very uncomfortable game of human Tetris. Pajamas weren't a thing. You slept in whatever you wore during the day. If it was winter, you added more layers. If it was summer, you just dealt with it and tried not to stick to your cousin's elbow. There was little concept of personal space. The warmth of bodies was more important than modesty, especially during those bone-cracking winters. And if someone snored? Tough. If someone rolled over and took the blanket, assuming there was a blanket, you either took it back or simmered silently with a grudge for 3 decades. But if you were a bit wealthier, say a successful tradesman or a mid-tier town official, you might be able to elevate your sleeping setup. Literally. You could put your straw mattress on a wooden frame. Fancy, right? It helped with air circulation and reduced direct contact with the cold floor. It also slightly lowered your chances of waking up with something crawling on your face, but only slightly. Now, for the truly rich, beds took on an entirely different meaning. In noble households, a bed wasn't just furniture. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and soft things most people would never experience. Large wooden frames, ornate carvings, and high posts with curtains that could be drawn to block out drafts and hopefully gossiping servants. These elite beds had feather mattresses, stacked sometimes 2 or 3 deep. Sheets were linen, occasionally embroidered. Canopies hung above to trap warmth and repel bugs. Pillows, quilts, and even fur throws added layers of luxury. Honestly, it sounds amazing until you realize none of it stopped the lice. You just got fancy lice. These beds were so valuable, they were named in wills. You might not inherit land, but you would inherit Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Lucky you. Of course, all that fluff didn't mean you slept alone. Even nobles often shared their beds. Servants, children, political guests, they all climbed in. Sometimes it was strategy, sometimes just logistics. A big bed was easier to share than a cold hallway. In castles and manor houses, beds were often located in chambers with tapestries on the walls. Not for art, but for insulation. Stone is beautiful, sure, but it's also freezing. So beds became cocoons in every sense. Warmth, privacy, and a mild guarantee that no one would sneeze on you from across the room. But even in these plush settings, sleep was unpredictable. Drafts found you, insects found you. Loud weather, noisy household staff, and the occasional goat in the wrong corridor found you. Because this was medieval life. No matter how soft your mattress, you were still at the mercy of reality. Let's also not forget about maintenance. Feather mattresses needed regular fluffing, literally beaten into shape. Straw had to be replaced every few weeks unless you liked sleeping on compressed oatmeal. And if your family was particularly creative, you might stuff your pallet with rushes, leaves, or even moss. All of which sound poetic until you consider the smell. And the smell? Oh yes. Hygiene wasn't a major bedtime concern. Most people bathed infrequently, wore the same undertunic for days, and co-slept in tightly packed quarters. Add livestock lingering nearby and a fire that never fully aired out the room, and you've got what historians call the fragrant medieval night. Or at least we should call it that. Yet for all the discomfort, people slept. They adapted. Their bodies adjusted to the ache of straw, the weight of shared blankets, the sounds of others shifting beside them. Because sleep wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. You needed energy to face the next day's work, whether it was milking cows, avoiding your feudal lord, or trying not to die of dysentery. So tonight, when you slide into your climate-controlled memory foam bed with 6 pillows and a Bluetooth diffuser burping lavender into the air, just remember, somewhere in your DNA is a medieval sleeper curled up on straw, dreaming beneath a leaky roof, wearing the same tunic they worked in, and probably elbow deep in goats. You've heard the rustle of straw and felt the bite of cold in a peasant's sleep pile. But now, let's climb the crooked stone stairs to the other end of the medieval sleep spectrum. The bedrooms of the wealthy. Here, you don't sleep on the floor. You ascend to bed like a minor deity retiring for the night. Let's start with the bed frame itself. This wasn't some flat-pack pine thing with an Allen wrench and a prayer, no. A noble bed in the Middle Ages was a monument to carpentry. Made from oak, walnut, or chestnut, these wooden giants loomed in the corner of a room like altars. They were carved with lions, vines, family crests, and sometimes slightly terrifying angelic figures with judgmental eyebrows. But that wasn't the real status symbol. The feather in your medieval cap, quite literally, was the mattress. Unlike the poor who had straw, you had layers, and layers upon layers of feather mattresses, stacked like some dusty, drafty version of the Princess and the Pea. Goose feathers if you were lucky, swan if you were regal, and occasionally down from less enthusiastic barnyard contributors. These beds didn't just soften the sleep, they announced it. Climbing into bed took effort. You didn't so much sit down as you climbed up and flopped over like royalty, trying not to wrinkle a brocade tunic. And then came the linens. Sheets of fine linen or even silk if you were ridiculously wealthy, hand-embroidered and laundered by a small army of servants. Pillowcases were stitched with initials or saints, and quilts were layered with velvet, wool, or fur depending on the season, and your tolerance for moths. Most noble beds also had canopies and curtains, not just for show, but for survival. Drafts were the ancient enemy, sneaking through stone walls and making your toes consider rebellion. Those heavy drapes hanging around the bed trapped heat, kept out insects, allegedly, and added a certain privacy when the room itself might still contain your steward, your children, or your eternally disappointed mother-in-law. These beds were so valuable they were treated like heirlooms. You didn't just pass down land or livestock, you passed down the bed. In fact, beds were named in wills, right alongside horses and estates. To my eldest son, I bequeath the great carved bed with lions, and may it not collapse beneath his sins. Something like that. Still, don't let the fluff fool you. Even among the elite, these beds weren't bug-free paradises. You still had fleas, you still had lice. And bedbugs, those sneaky little medieval vampires, loved feather mattresses as much as you did. Which is why the wealthy wore nightcaps, nightshirts, and occasionally bedgloves. Not to be fashionable, but to form some kind of human burrito armor against the crawlies. And then there was the company. Sleeping alone, even in a grand bed, was rare. You might share it with your spouse, your children, your visiting brother-in-law, or your favorite lapdog, who was not necessarily lap-sized. Privacy was a rumor. Space was a myth. And if someone had a nightmare and started screaming, the entire bed became a community support group, complete with whispered prayers and someone trying to remember which saint handled dream demons. Now, beyond the soft textures and ornate headboards, there was a social function to these beds. This was where alliances were whispered, secrets were shared, and sometimes even politics happened. Letters were read and composed in bed. Women met with their household staff in bed. Some noblewomen held court from bed, lounging beneath canopies while managing estate affairs with the calm air of someone who definitely wasn't stuck under 6 pounds of wool and embroidery. In fact, the bed was often the centerpiece of the chamber, raised on a dais flanked by candles and occasionally protected by intricately carved bed testers. Not people who test your mattress firmness, but a wooden frame above the bed to support curtains and display your wealth. Basically, your bed had its own fashion accessories. And unlike today's sleepyhead shuffle into pajamas, bedtime for nobles could be an event. You might be helped into your nightclothes by a servant, hair braided or wrapped for modesty, feet cleaned, a warm drink delivered. The ritual wasn't just about comfort, it was about maintaining the dignity of your class, even when unconscious. Because nothing says noble authority like snoring gently beneath a gold-threaded blanket, while a maid places a coal-warmed brick at your feet. Of course, with all this pampering came one enormous risk: fires. These beds were flammable fortresses, curtains, canopies, dry wood, all just waiting for a careless candle to ignite your dreams in the worst way possible. So if you ever wondered why so many castles burned down, it might have had less to do with enemy sieges and more to do with someone sneezing near a sconce. Still, despite the bugs, the snoring entourage, and the existential fire hazard, sleeping in a noble bed was one of the great luxuries of the medieval world. It meant warmth, status, a place to rest your bones in something other than damp straw. But most importantly, it meant you had survived another day. A day of plague, politics, bad bread, or worse, peasant uprisings. So when you curled beneath layers of embroidered linen and tried to ignore the sound of your neighbors softly weeping into their feather pillow, again, you were living the high life. And all while dreaming about the one thing no one could ever seem to keep out of their bed: more bugs. You're tucked in now, under layers of linen and fur, nestled in your straw or feathers, maybe still avoiding the elbow of a cousin or the cold nose of a hound. But there's something else wrapped around your head. Not a thought, not a dream, an actual object. The nightcap. Let's clear something up. When we hear nightcap today, we imagine something warm and alcoholic, ideally sipped beside a crackling fire with the gentle regret of knowing you'll text someone you shouldn't. But in the medieval world, a nightcap was exactly what it sounds like. A literal cap you wore to bed. And yes, it looked exactly as ridiculous as you're picturing. These hats weren't stylish. They weren't embroidered with sexy slogans. They weren't sold in velvet gift boxes with tiny bottles of scented linen spray. They were, frankly, weird little tubes of desperation, made to keep your ears attached during cold nights. Here's the thing, medieval homes were freezing, and not in a my toes are a little chilly sort of way. More like, if I breathe in too hard, I might get icicles in my lungs. You're in a house built from stone or wood, with drafts that have names and no insulation to speak of. Your windows are covered in parchment or thin horn slices, not glass, and your roof is essentially a loose pile of grass hoping it doesn't rain. So yes, you wear a hat to bed. And not just any hat, a long pointed one, usually knit or sewn from wool or linen. It droops down like a wizard's after a hard night of drinking. Sometimes it even has a little tassel. You look like a cartoon burglar trying to reform by asleep. But that nightcap, it does the job. Most body heat escapes through the head, and in a world without central heating, the best way to avoid becoming a bedtime meat popsicle was to cover your noggin. For men, it was practical. For women, it was multifunctional. A woman's nightcap could also act as a coif, a head covering that preserved modesty and kept hair in place. And when I say kept hair in place, I mean hid the fact that it hadn't seen soap since the last major feast day. Washing your hair in winter was a bit like choosing to bathe in regret. So women covered it, even while asleep, especially while asleep. And it wasn't just about warmth or hygiene. In many regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times. Indoors, outdoors, asleep, awake, it didn't matter. A bare head on a married woman was either a scandal or a punishment. So the nightcap was more than just cozy headgear. It was a symbol of status, morality, and social order, all wrapped up in one itchy little cone. Some nightcaps were embroidered or dyed, especially among the wealthy. A bright-colored cap might suggest wealth, or at least access to fabric that didn't smell like cabbage stew. For peasants, it was usually plain wool. If it looked like it had been repurposed from a shirt sleeve or sock, it probably had. And for the record, these weren't optional. If someone opened their front door at night wearing a cap, it wasn't an invitation. It was a message. A polite medieval way of saying, "I am not dressed for conversation or for you." In some towns, seeing someone in their nightcap during a domestic dispute was the 14th century equivalent of someone storming onto the porch in their bathrobe, wielding a ladle ready to fight. Of course, the hat was usually paired with a nightshirt, a long, loose tunic worn to bed by both men and women. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the ghost and emotional growth. These garments were practical, warm, and sometimes the only change of clothes you had that wasn't stiff with dried sweat. They reached mid-calf or lower, were often patched, and had sleeves long enough to cover your hands if needed. Some had belts or ties, others just sort of hung there like a potato sack in the morning. If you were rich, your nightshirt might be made of linen. If not, wool. If you were really out of luck, burlap. Not soft, but durable enough to withstand multiple wears and the occasional bedbug skirmish. And for the elite, sleepwear could be surprisingly elegant. Embroidered cuffs, dyed fabric, even delicate trim. Not for comfort, but because if anyone important ever caught you unconscious, you still needed to look the part. After all, nobility doesn't end when you close your eyes. It just snores in Latin. Let's also remember, you didn't have blankets the way we do now. Many families use shared quilts or animal skins. Poorer folks might sleep under cloaks or whatever wasn't actively being worn. So your nightcap and nightshirt did more than preserve dignity. They were defense against the night. Soft armor, layered against the drafts that crept in through shutters and slithered across the floor like petty spirits looking for toes. Historians still debate whether certain nightwear was meant more for modesty or health, but either way the layers served double duty. Protect the body, shield the soul. Some religious manuals even advised covering the head during sleep as a way to keep bad dreams and worse spirits from entering. Which, depending on your belief system, means that wool hat may have been your only line of defense against demonic possession through the ears. Sweet dreams. But perhaps the most curious thing about the nightcap was its ritual quality. You didn't just throw it on. You tied it, folded it, placed it, like you were preparing to be seen by your ancestors. It marked the transition from waking labor to sleeping vulnerability. Once it was on, you were off duty. In fact, in towns where people lived packed together like ill-behaved chess pieces, seeing a nightcap in the window was a gentle social cue. Don't knock. Don't visit. Don't gossip. This person is officially done with the day. And if you think this sounds dramatic, just remember that in a world with no locks, no security cameras, and very porous walls, sleep was dangerous. You weren't just putting on a hat. You were declaring yourself at rest, unarmed, and momentarily out of the social game. So tonight, if you're tempted to laugh at those old-timey depictions of people sleeping in pointy hats, maybe pause and consider. They weren't silly. They were cold. They were tired. And they were doing their best to keep the lice out of their ears while trying not to freeze their personalities off. All things considered, that floppy wool cone, it was kind of heroic. Let's say you're a traveler in the year 1352. You've been riding since sunrise. Your mule is grumpy, your legs feel like boiled cabbage, and you've run out of bread 3 villages ago. Night's falling, the trees are making threatening creaky noises, and the wolves are already taking attendance. You need shelter, preferably one that doesn't have teeth. So you find it an inn. Glorious, glowing, slightly leaning with a sign swinging above the door that might depict a chicken or a dragon or a goat with performance anxiety. Doesn't matter, you push open the door, stomp off the dust, and ask for a bed. And this is where your expectations, shaped by modern travel with its key cards, room service, and privacy, are about to be mugged by medieval reality. Because at a medieval inn, you don't get a room. You don't even get a bed to yourself. What you get is a spot in a bed that is already occupied. By strangers, sometimes multiple. Welcome to the world of communal sleeping for survival and profit. You might find yourself climbing into a bed with a tinker, a friar, and a sailor who all snore in different dialects. Or with a heavily perfumed merchant whose boots remain stubbornly attached. Or with someone you vaguely recognize from a local arrest record. Either way, you're sharing. And before you ask, no, this wasn't considered weird. Beds in medieval inns were commodities, not sanctuaries. Think of them as medieval Airbnb bunk beds, except no one cleaned the sheets and personal boundaries were a myth. If there was space in the bed, it got filled. 2 to 4 people per mattress, depending on size, desperation, and general apathy toward hygiene. Privacy? That's adorable. The only privacy you might get is if someone burps under the blanket and nobody makes eye contact. That's the code. The layout of inns wasn't cozy either. Picture long dormitory-style rooms, rows of beds, sometimes just straw pallets, packed wall to wall. The sounds? Snoring, mumbling, shifting, and the occasional nighttime gasp when someone realizes the lump they rolled onto isn't a blanket. It's just Brian. In some larger towns, inns tried to introduce a system. You might be assigned a bed based on your profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, monks with monks, thieves with thieves, although that one was often wishful thinking. But more often than not, it was first come, first sprawled. The idea of booking a room didn't exist in the way we know it. You paid a fee for the right to horizontal space, and not even clean horizontal space. Just a patch of mattress or hay with bonus snoring partners, and don't forget the smells. Let's just say this isn't lavender-scented pillow mist territory. You've got the combined aroma of feet, sweat, moldy straw, wet wool, and regret, all marinating together under low beams and flickering candles. People hadn't bathed in days. Some might be sleeping in leather armor. One guy insists on keeping his boots on for safety. You share a blanket that has seen things, and your pillow might actually be a sack of turnips. No one asks. The risk of theft was real. Travelers often tied their coin pouches to their belts and tucked them under their tunics while sleeping. Some even wrapped arms around their satchels, sleeping with one eye half open, trained on any handsy neighbors. If your bag shifted in the night, it probably meant you were about to wake up poorer and slightly more disappointed in humanity. Some travelers got clever. They slept on top of their bundles, using their own belongings as both mattress and alarm system. Others deliberately picked a spot near the wall, only one direction to defend. But none of these methods were foolproof. Inns, for all their rickety charm, were notorious for petty crime and, occasionally, full-on robbery. One bad roll to the left, and you might end up spooning someone who steals both your purse and your socks. Still, it beat sleeping outside. That was the true comparison. Sharing a bed with 3 snoring strangers wasn't ideal, but at least you weren't out in the rain with wolves, wandering bandits, or the cold indifference of nature. Medieval life was harsh, and comfort was often sacrificed for safety and shelter. Nobles, of course, didn't deal with any of this. They traveled with entourages, teams of servants, guards, cooks, and that one cousin who always smelled like pears. When they stopped at inns, they could demand private quarters, sometimes entire rooms cleared out for their convenience. An innkeeper might lose profits for the night, but they kept their roof intact and didn't get fed to a local dungeon. The rest of the population had to tough it out, and yet, this chaotic, elbow-filled experience created its own social fabric. You learned things about people, their regional accents, their family drama, their favorite songs sung drunkenly at midnight. You might hear a sailor mumble about ghosts at sea or a baker's apprentice whisper a prayer in the dark. It wasn't just sleep, it was exposure. A window into the many weird, weary lives packed into one bed-sized reality. And if someone farted, well, you dealt with it. You had no choice. It was medieval ambiance. So next time you complain about thin hotel walls or someone snoring on the other side of your Airbnb, imagine sharing your mattress with 3 strangers and their breakfast leftovers. Because in the Middle Ages, a bed wasn't just a bed. It was a shared story. A space negotiated with warmth, weariness, and a pinch of unspoken desperation. You lie down, bundled in your nightshirt, nightcap slightly askew, nestled beside your family, a stranger, or both. The fire has dimmed to its final glow. The straw itches. Someone coughs. And now, it's time to think about death. Yes, that escalated quickly. But in the medieval world, going to bed was never just sleep. It was a tiny rehearsal for dying every night. So before your eyes flutter closed, you're expected to say your prayers. Not out of piety, though that helped, but because you might not wake up. And in an era where sudden illness, house fires, or oops, we accidentally burned the village down again, were all legitimate bedtime risks, preparing your soul became part of the bedtime routine. You didn't just fluff your pillow, you spiritually detoxed. The most common medieval bedtime prayer was chillingly familiar. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet, right? Except it's basically a toddler's version of a legal clause, acknowledging that death might show up before breakfast. You're not just tucking in, you're spiritually packing a go bag. For adults, the prayers were longer, deeper, and occasionally terrifying. Whole collections of bed prayers existed, tailored to your social station, your sins, or your specific bedtime anxieties. Some whispered psalms. Others made confessions in the dark, just in case a demon crawled in through the rafters mid-REM. Because here's the truth. Medieval people didn't expect to live long, and they definitely didn't trust the night. Disease could strike with no warning. Fires could spread faster than you could mutter a Hail Mary. And in a time before antibiotics, central heating or smoke detectors going to sleep meant flirting with the unknown. So prayers were your protection. They weren't cozy affirmations like, I am safe, I am loved. They were more like, Dear God, I know I yelled at Marjorie and thought unclean thoughts about the Cooper's son, but please, please let me wake up tomorrow. Some households had nightly rituals as serious as a funeral. Families knelt by the hearth, whispered blessings over each other, and crossed themselves in sequence. Children were taught to pray not for good dreams, but for soul safety. A parent might remind them gently, if you die tonight, the angels are watching. Which is both reassuring and terrifying, depending on how well-behaved you've been. Monks and nuns took this to the next level. In monasteries, the day ended with compline, the final prayer service before silence descended like a woolen curtain. After compline, a vow of silence took effect. No talking, no laughter, no complaining about how Brother Arnulf stole your bedding again. Just quiet, cold contemplation as you lay in rows on your straw-filled mattress, hoping God was pleased with your Tuesday. The compline service was rich in psalms, hymns, and layered with the heavy sense that this might be your final bedtime. Think of it like spiritual antivirus software. You recited it not because you were confident, but because you were terrified not to. If something went wrong during the night, say, death by plague rat, you wanted your spiritual paperwork in order. And if you were extra anxious, you might pray to specific saints. There were saints for travelers, saints for children, saints for nervous sleepers, saints for protection against nightmares. Some people even invoked Saint Michael the Archangel, not because he was cuddly, but because you wanted a big celestial bouncer at your bedroom door. Oh, and let's not forget amulets. Many sleepers hung crosses above their beds, tucked relics into their pillowcases, or whispered secret chants to ward off demons. These weren't superstitions, they were spiritual safeguards. Because if you didn't wake up, at least you had tried, and if you did wake up, bonus! Time to do it all again tomorrow. But spiritual preparation wasn't limited to religion. Even secular folk, Those less devoted to daily mass understood the fragility of life. Bedtime was a moment of reflection. You might think back on your day, your mistakes, your regrets. You might kiss your loved ones goodnight as though it were the last time, because it might be. The night carried weight, gravity, shadows that weren't just moonlight, and in a way that made medieval bedtime more honest than ours. Today, we sidestep mortality. We distract ourselves with streaming platforms, ambient playlists, and 10-step skincare rituals involving products named after fruits that don't exist. But in the Middle Ages, there was no buffer. Just the cold, the quiet, and the humbling reminder that you were, in the grand scheme, fragile as straw. Of course, not everyone was solemn about it. Some people likely muttered their prayers with one eye half closed or made sarcastic remarks about St. Cuthbert's nightly no-show. Others probably forgot entirely, or faked it just to please their spouse. But even the ritual of pretending underscored the cultural weight of bedtime. It wasn't just a personal habit, it was communal expectation. It's worth noting that many of these prayers survive today, though stripped of their medieval context. Now I lay me down to sleep. Still echoes in nurseries, now spoken with comfort rather than dread. But once upon a time, those same words were a whispered hedge against eternity. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in and adjust your pillow just so, remember, medieval people didn't just sleep. They braced. They whispered into the dark not because they were superstitious fools, but because they understood something we often forget. That the night is deep, that the world is fragile, and that sleep is not always a guarantee, but a gift. Sleep takes you again, second sleep this time, and your body is heavy, slack, deeply resting. But your mind, your soul? In the medieval worldview, those parts don't stay put. They wander. Because in the Middle Ages, dreams weren't random. They weren't the aftermath of cheese or a long day or too much mead. Dreams were serious business. Messages, warnings, prophecies, possibly even spiritual diagnostics, where God or the devil or your overly judgmental guardian angel dropped by to evaluate your subconscious. You dream of falling straight into a pit of boiling tar. You wake in a cold sweat, not because it was scary, but because, according to one 12th century dream manual, that might be a sign of moral failure. Or possibly gout. The line between theology and medicine got real blurry. The medieval sleeper wasn't just a body at rest. They were a soul on tour. And where that soul went mattered. Take theologians like Augustine or Aquinas. They wrote extensively about the morality of dreams. Were you responsible for sins committed in a dream? Could the devil plant dreams to tempt you? Could saints communicate through your dreams, using metaphor and deeply confusing symbolism? The answer, always maybe. Because in the Middle Ages, dreams were porous things, and the veil between the natural and supernatural world was paper thin. Monks recorded dreams in their journals. Visionary nuns like Hildegard of Bingen claimed full-on divine revelations while asleep, whole landscapes of symbolism, color, and celestial instruction. These weren't shrugged off. These were studied, debated, passed around like sacred gossip. There were even entire books of dream interpretation, most of which read like slightly deranged horoscopes. Dream of water could be purification or drowning. Dream of birds might mean freedom or death. Dream of your teeth falling out? Definitely the devil. Always the devil. One particularly dramatic guide warns that if you dream of a man with the head of a goat juggling fish, you should fast for 3 days and possibly burn your bedding. Just to be safe. Of course, not all dreams were treated equally. If you were a peasant and dreamt of flying, no one cared. But if a nun dreamt of the Virgin Mary handing her a flaming key, that made it into the chronicles. Dreams were hierarchical, just like everything else. Holy dreams came from monks and noblewomen. Ordinary dreams were assumed to be indigestion. Still, everyone feared nightmares. Not just because they were frightening, but because they could be evidence of demonic interference. The medieval imagination was filled with night terrors made flesh. Succubi, incubi, and the dreaded night hag, who sat on your chest while you slept, draining your breath and planting wicked thoughts. Basically, the original sleep paralysis demon, only with a name and a family tree. If you were plagued by such dreams, there were remedies. Hang protective amulets. Sleep with a candle lit. Sprinkle salt at the threshold of your door. One monk even recommended placing a crucifix on your forehead as you slept. Yes, forehead. You looked ridiculous. But you were safe. Probably. And what of pleasant dreams? They weren't always pleasant in meaning. Dream of kissing someone you like? Might be a sin creeping in. Dream of gold? Could mean greed is taking hold. The medieval dreamscape wasn't just surreal, it was judgmental. There was always the sense that someone, somewhere, possibly St. Jerome, was reviewing your dreams like a harsh literary critic. But dreams were also entertainment. Many medieval stories used dreams as framing devices. Poets loved them. Knights in romances often dreamt of angels giving them swords, or dragons telling them to repent, or castles rising from lakes. These weren't just narrative devices, they were how the medieval world wrestled with morality and identity. Sleep was the theater. Dreams were the plays. And you? You were the audience, the actor and the critic all at once. Historians still argue whether medieval people believed every dream was literal. Some clearly didn't. Others were absolutely convinced. It likely depended on the dream, the person, and whether there had been mushrooms at supper. But one thing is clear. Dreams mattered. They were not throwaway images. They were analyzed, discussed, even confessed. That's right, confessed. If you dreamt of stealing bread or slapping a priest, you might be urged to speak to your confessor, just in case your subconscious was revealing real sin. Because, remember, the soul roamed free while you slept, and that roaming could get you in trouble. Better to repent for things you didn't do than risk eternal damnation for a dream version of yourself that clearly lacked restraint. For children, dreams were both a curiosity and a tool. Parents would sometimes interpret a child's dream as a sign of divine favor or corruption. A particularly strange dream might be shared with the local priest. A funny one might make it into the family's oral history, like, remember when little Wolfgard dreamt of marrying a chicken and cried for 3 days? Dreams, then, were part of life, part of sleep. Not just the oddities of the mind, but the language of the soul. You didn't ignore them. You listened. And when you woke, if you remembered your dreams, you decided what to do. Write it down. Whisper it to a friend. Fast. Pray. Or simply thank God that it wasn't a demon riding your chest again. Tonight, as you slip into second sleep, imagine this. Your dreams aren't noise. They're messages, confessions, visitors from another world, some divine, some mischievous, some just shaped like goats juggling fish. And when you wake, you carry a piece of that world with you. Sleep well, but not too soundly. You wouldn't want to miss a good omen. Picture this. You're finally warm. The fire's down to its last glowing sigh. The kids are dozing, someone's muttering in their sleep, possibly a prayer, possibly about cheese. And nestled right beside you is a shaggy dog. At your feet, 2 chickens. And if you're very lucky, a pig pressed up against your spine like a snorting hot water bottle. No, this isn't some bizarre medieval Noah's Ark dream. This was bedtime reality for most people in the Middle Ages. Humans and animals sleeping together. Not for affection, but for survival. Let's set the scene. A peasant's home in the 14th century Europe was often one single room. Maybe 2 if you were fancy. There's the hearth in the middle, a small table, a few stools, a loft or corner for sleeping, and animals. Because why keep them outside exposed to the cold, the wolves or thieves with suspicious cheese cravings, when you could bring them in? cows, pigs, chickens, goats, dogs, cats, all inside. Maybe not every animal every night, but certainly the ones you couldn't afford to lose. And definitely the ones that radiated enough body heat to stop your toes from turning into ice cubes. Chickens provided a touch of warmth, but they were mostly alarm clocks with feathers. Pigs and cows were the true MVPs of medieval insulation. And this wasn't considered weird. In fact, it was common enough to go unremarked in records. Just like you'd say, "I turned up the heat," a medieval villager might say, "I brought the pig in." Same intent, very different smell. Medieval homes weren't known for their weather-tight architecture. You had stone or timber walls that didn't retain heat, thatched roofs that leaked like a gossiping nun, and no insulation except for whatever moss, rags, or miracle you could shove into a crack. So animals came inside. Body heat was everything. A single cow can emit as much heat as a small space heater. A pig? Surprisingly warm. Add a couple of shaggy dogs and one feral cat that may or may not belong to you, and you had a makeshift heating system that didn't require firewood. Or maintenance. Just the occasional nudge when someone snored too loud or decided your stomach was a better bed than their straw pile. And the animals didn't necessarily sleep in a designated pet corner. Nope. They mingled. A goat might wander over and lie next to your toddler. A chicken might decide your pillow is the ideal perch. A dog curls up near your feet, because that's where the crumbs fall. And yes, you slept through it. Because you were exhausted and cold, and because this was just life. Of course, this wasn't limited to peasants. Even the moderately well-off might have a dog or two sharing the bed. Not as heaters, but as status symbols. Small lap dogs, especially in France and Italy, were fashionable companions. But let's not pretend nobles escaped the fleas. If anything, those lapdogs were just carriers in velvet collars. There's even evidence of dogs having their own beds in noble households, though whether they used them or promptly ignored them like modern pets is anyone's guess. Some castles reportedly had entire rooms devoted to prized hunting dogs. That's right. Your bedroom was a shared hay pile, but Lord Trotter's beagle had a whole chamber with tapestries. Back in peasant huts, animals weren't just tolerated. They were often the family's most valuable assets. Your pig might be your entire winter food source. Your cow, your milk, and butter. So of course you kept them close. Sometimes even closer than extended family members who, frankly, didn't contribute as much or smell as agreeable. And there were benefits beyond heat. Animals were early warning systems. If a stranger approached, the dog barked. If something rustled outside, the pig grunted. Chickens squawked at nothing, but occasionally nailed a fox sighting. You could sleep knowing you had four-legged security that doubled as living radiators. Now, was it comfortable? Let's not pretend. Animals are noisy, smelly, and have no concept of personal space. A goat might step on your face. A pig might roll over and trap your leg. A chicken might poop somewhere deeply inconvenient. And hygiene? Let's just say it wasn't anyone's strong suit. You adapted. You accepted. You learned to sleep through hooves and snorts and feathers in your mouth because you had no choice. Even city dwellers dealt with animals at night. Urban homes often had livestock in the courtyard or even beneath the main floor, in what passed for a basement. The heat from the animals would rise into the room above, providing just enough warmth to keep your teeth from chattering out of your skull. And while the upper classes didn't need pigs in bed, they did have their own creature comforts. Cats roamed noble bedrooms, welcomed for their mousing skills. Dogs, especially small ones, became accessories as well as companions. They weren't just tolerated, they were pampered. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly had little dogs who slept beside her. Not that she needed the warmth, but hey, tradition. It wasn't all practical. Some people genuinely loved their animals. There are poems about sleeping next to faithful hounds, stories of cats curling beside sick children, and even records of pigs given names and bedtime routines. The line between survival tool and family member was always blurry. Of course, not everyone approved. Church sermons occasionally warned against excessive affection toward animals, especially when it interfered with nightly prayers, but even priests probably had a dog curled under the bench when no one was looking. In the end, medieval sleep was a team sport. Family, strangers, and livestock, all crammed into one shared effort to make it through another freezing night. And while it might sound chaotic, maybe even gross, it was remarkably effective. Because sometimes the best way to survive the cold wasn't a fancy blanket or a roaring fire. It was a pig snoring softly against your back, a chicken at your feet, and the quiet reassurance that you weren't alone in the dark. Now forget the straw piles, the snoring pigs, and the drafty stone cottages, just for a moment. And follow me into the chill silence of a stone-walled dormitory, where rows of wooden beds lie like solemn coffins under flickering candlelight. You've stepped into the world of the medieval monastery where comfort went to die, and discipline tucked you in at night. If you thought sharing a mattress with 3 strangers and a goat was bad, allow me to introduce you to monastic sleep. A nightly experience so Spartan, so joyless, it could make a Benedictine monk weep, though quietly and only with permission. Let's begin with the layout. Monastic dormitories weren't cozy nooks for peaceful slumber. They were long, open halls, sometimes above the cloister walk, sometimes directly above the chapel itself. Because what's more restful than sleeping above a room full of whispered Latin? No partitions, no curtains, no privacy. Just rows of beds, if you were lucky. Or, more commonly, wooden planks with a thin sack of straw and a blanket made from enough wool to itch through your soul. You didn't sleep naked or even in a nightshirt. Oh no, monks slept in their habits, the same robes they wore all day, belted, hooded, sandaled sometimes. The reasoning? If you got called for a midnight prayer, and you didn't have to change. You just rolled off your board, tried not to groan audibly, and shuffled into line with the others like a very humble sleepwalker. Monastic sleep wasn't just about when or where, it was about how much and how little. The rule of Saint Benedict, the holy blueprint for monastic life, dictated nearly every aspect of a monk's day. It also carved out exactly how much rest was acceptable before sloth set in and ruined everything. 8 hours of uninterrupted bliss? Absolutely not. Try 4 to 6 hours broken up by nighttime prayers, and this wasn't optional. If the bell rang at 2:30 a.m. for matins, you got up, even if your legs had gone numb, even if you'd just fallen asleep, even if your roommate Brother Godric was snoring like a warhorse on his side of the room. And speaking of snoring, that was a problem. Not because it was frowned upon, it was, but because monks weren't supposed to complain. So if Brother Bernard's nasal orchestra was keeping you awake, you could either suffer in silence, move your plank, or offer it up as penance. Probably while praying for deliverance from nasal demons. The dormitory was under strict silence, except during emergencies. Want to whisper to your bunkmate about the bread rations? Number thinking of humming a psalm before sleep? Absolutely not. You were to lie in complete silence, hands crossed over your chest, eyes closed, thoughts clean. Of course, thoughts didn't always cooperate, which is why some monastic orders discouraged even dreaming. Too much imagination at night? A sign of moral weakness. Some monks even trained themselves to sleep in positions that discouraged dreams, upright or sitting, or with their heads elevated to prevent the vapors from stirring the humors into temptation. Yes, really. In fact, some orders instructed monks to sleep sitting against a wall, or leaning slightly forward on a stool, arms crossed, like very determined corpses. The idea was that lying flat invited luxury, and luxury invited sin. So the solution? Deprivation. Physical discomfort as a spiritual filter. Now let's talk lighting. There was none. Maybe one candle at the far end of the dormitory, flickering like a nervous moth. The goal was stillness, not ambiance. You didn't need to see anything. You weren't here to read. You were here to not sin quietly in the dark. Chamber pots? Oh, they existed. But getting to them in the pitch dark, in total silence, while wrapped in a floor-length robe and trying not to trip over Brother Sebastian's sandals was, well, an exercise in humility and possibly shin bruises. If you were new to the monastery, say a fresh-faced novice from the countryside, the shock of this nightly regime could be overwhelming. No warmth, no comfort, no pillow unless your abbot was feeling generous or you were recovering from the plague. Even then, you were expected to thank God and return to your straw post-haste. But here's the thing, the monks didn't see this as punishment. This was training. Every night of half-sleep on a wooden slab was a night of spiritual conditioning. You weren't just denying the body, you were preparing the soul for heaven. Sleep wasn't rest, it was surrender. Monastic sleep taught discipline, endurance, obedience. And in a strange way, it created solidarity. The cold, the dark, the quiet, they were shared burdens. Your brother monks were all suffering beside you, heads bowed, breath shallow, dreams denied. You weren't alone in your discomfort. You were together in holiness. Even the most minor deviations were taken seriously. There are records of monks being punished for rolling over too loudly, for twitching, or for failing to be still. And yet, no one considered this cruelty. It was devotion measured in sleeplessness. Historians still debate whether all monastic orders were this rigid. The Benedictines, for example, were strict but balanced. The Carthusians, on the other hand, leaned full ascetic and probably considered a straw mattress too indulgent. But across all orders, the underlying belief remained: sleep must not become an idol. So tonight, as you lie in your soft bed, wrapped in blankets, perhaps serenaded by white noise or gentle rain sounds, think of those monks. No pillows, no pajamas, no complaints. Just silence, cold straw, and a vow. You're asleep again, curled under wool, face to the wall, one eye may be cracked open against the cold. But then, clang, the bell tolls. Not the romantic kind, not the dinner's ready kind. This is the God wants you up at 2 a.m. Kind. Welcome to Matins, the divine interruption. In medieval monasteries, the day didn't begin at sunrise. It began in darkness, in cold stone chapels, long before the first rooster even considered coughing. Matins, the first canonical hour, was the midnight service that sliced into sleep like a holy cleaver. And if you lived under the rule of St. Benedict, or just happened to be within earshot of the bell, you got up. Yes, voluntarily at 2 or 3 in the morning. There was no snooze button, no muttering, 5 more minutes. When that bell rang, you rose like a humble zombie, robed, barefoot, silently filing out of the dormitory with your fellow monks like a parade of sleepy saints. You didn't talk, you didn't stretch, you definitely didn't complain. You shuffled, you prayed, and you tried not to trip over Brother Matthew's habit hem, which he still hadn't shortened, even after the last 2 wake-up collisions. Why so early? Why the insistence on interrupting what little fragmented sleep you had left? The idea was simple. The earliest part of the night belonged to God. Before the mind was cluttered with chores or temptations, before the body was softened by the comfort of blankets or dreams, you were to offer the purest hour of your night in service. Prayer at this time was considered especially potent, especially sacrificial. The darkness didn't just separate day from night, it separated the devout from the lazy. The rituals of Matins varied by monastery, but most included psalms, antiphons, scripture readings, and sometimes responsories. Musical call and response verses that helped keep you from falling asleep upright, which was a real and documented issue. Yes, monks fell asleep during Matins, of course they did. Who wouldn't? You're exhausted. Your stomach is empty, your feet are freezing, and you're trying to chant Psalm 119 without face-planting into the nearest pew. Some monasteries punished dozing during matins with extra chores. Others required the offender to sit on a cold bench during the next service or eat bread without honey at breakfast. Which is hilarious until you realize that bread with honey was basically the medieval version of a cappuccino and avocado toast. And then there's the chanting. Gregorian chant wasn't about performance, it was about rhythm, meditation, and unity. Under the vaulted ceilings of a dark stone chapel, it wasn't uncommon for the sound of 30 monks harmonizing in Latin to create an atmosphere that was strangely transcendent, like standing inside a music box made of stone and candlelight. But don't romanticize it too much. Your stomach's still rumbling, you're half frozen, and there's a faint draft that hits your ankles every time someone moves. The floor's damp, the benches are hard, and the candle smoke makes your eyes sting. Some orders, especially the stricter ones, held matins for up to 2 hours. 2 hours. Imagine trying to focus while your body is actively begging to collapse, and your brain is halfway through a dream about pears that turns out to be a metaphor for sin. And after all that, you didn't always go back to bed. In certain orders, particularly in later centuries, matins would merge straight into lauds, the dawn prayer. So by the time you were technically allowed to rest again, the sun was already teasing the horizon, and your schedule said, "Time to sweep the cloister." Some monks did return to bed for second sleep, though by then the room was cold again, your straw had flattened, and Brother Crispin had definitely stolen your corner of the blanket. Again. Outside the cloister, the influence of matins reached lay communities too. Church bells rang out in the dead of night, sometimes waking the whole village. Even peasants, if they lived near a church, might hear the toll and mutter a sleepy prayer before turning over. It wasn't expected for everyone to attend matins, but it was understood that someone was. The monks were awake, chanting, praying, holding the spiritual line while the rest of the world slept. It created a sense of continuity, a reassurance that while you dreamed, someone was keeping the divine fires lit. Now, historians still debate how strictly this was followed. Not every monk was a zealot. Some monasteries were more lax, others borderline militaristic. Records show some monks just didn't show up occasionally, and a few abbots gave in to grumbling and moved matins to a slightly more humane hour. But the ideal persisted, sacrifice through sleeplessness. And the strange thing? Some monks reportedly loved it. Not the cold or the fatigue or the moldy sandals, but the stillness. The intimacy of praying in the quiet, when even the stars seemed hushed. The feeling of being part of something eternal, ancient, and mysterious. There's something deeply human in that image. A man half asleep, robes trailing, voice cracked with cold, singing in the dark. Not for recognition, not for comfort, but simply to offer the night back to God. So next time you're woken up at 2 a.m. by a pet, a dream, or just your own wandering mind, imagine those ancient bell towers. The doors creaking open, the sandals scraping across stone, a voice rising to meet the dark. Not every interruption is a disaster. Some are invitations. You stretch in the dark, pulling the blanket up under your chin, maybe rolling toward the wall, seeking that final patch of warmth. All is quiet. The fire is out. The dog at your feet sighs. You open one eye and realize with a sudden chill that you're alone. In the medieval world, this wasn't cozy. It wasn't empowering. It wasn't the dream of independent introverts. It was suspicious. Because sleeping alone in the Middle Ages, that was often a sign something was wrong, or at the very least, something people whispered about. Let's begin with the basics. Warmth. We've covered how drafty and under-insulated medieval buildings were. So the logic was simple. More bodies are more heat. Sharing a bed wasn't just a space-saving measure, it was your best chance of avoiding frostbite in February. Kids slept with siblings. Married couples shared with children. Guests, servants, cousins, anyone passing through might find themselves tucked in beside you. It was practical and normal. But the strangeness of sleeping alone went beyond comfort. There was a spiritual unease about solitude at night. Medieval people believed that the devil worked overtime in the dark, and if you were alone, you were considered more vulnerable to temptation. Or worse. Demons, after all, preferred one-on-one visits. Sleeping alone gave your imagination room to misbehave. With no one beside you to murmur a prayer or notice a twitch, a solitary night might turn into a spiritual battlefield. Temptation was believed to sneak in not through dreams, but through absence. Of company, of witnesses, of accountability. That's why even monasteries, at places devoted to solitude, still had monks sleeping side by side, rows of straw sacks and wooden boards, breathing the same damp air. You didn't get your own chamber unless you were a saint, a bishop, or in trouble. Yes, being assigned a private sleeping space was sometimes a punishment. If a monk broke the rules, disturbed the dormitory's silence, or was suspected of harboring sinful thoughts, whatever that meant, he might be removed from the group and made to sleep in isolation. The implication? You can't be trusted with your thoughts in the dark. Let's remove your audience. It was part correction, part spiritual exile. And among the laity, a person who chose to sleep alone might be considered antisocial, immoral, or just plain odd. A wife sleeping apart from her husband might raise eyebrows. Was she ill, angry, possessed? A single man in his own bed might be respected or suspected. Was he up to something? Was he a heretic? Was he engaging in nightly behavior that required distance? And if you were wealthy enough to have your own bed, but still shared it with no one, that could signal deep mistrust, or worse, arrogance. In a society so built on interdependence, a lone bed could feel like a fortress. People might admire it, but they definitely wouldn't feel comfortable around it. Even children were rarely allowed to sleep alone, not just for warmth, but because the night was full of stories, and most of them didn't end with happy ever afters. Fairies might come and steal you. Spirits could whisper temptations. Witches were known to ride young boys into the woods and leave only their shoes. Yes, that was a real belief, and somehow scarier than it sounds. So, kids were kept close. Parents told them angels were watching over them, but left unspoken was the idea that angels weren't watching everyone. Even the layout of medieval houses reflected this group sleeping logic. One room, one fire, one cluster of breathing, snoring, occasionally elbowing humanity. No secrets, no shadows, just shared air and the rhythmic rise and fall of sleep. Of course, not everyone disliked solitude. Some hermits and mystics sought it out, believing that spiritual clarity came in the silence of darkness, in the hours when the soul could speak without interruption. St. Cuthbert famously spent nights in isolated prayer, standing waist-deep in the sea until sunrise, which is arguably more commitment than most people have to their bedtime routine. But even these holy sleepers understood the risk of night solitude. They braced themselves with prayer, rituals, symbols drawn on doors. The line between sanctity and madness was razor thin, and if the night got too quiet, even the most devoted might start to wonder if that creaking noise was a spiritual awakening or just something with claws. Still, there were occasional benefits to solo sleep, especially for the elite. Nobles might seek privacy not for fear of demons, but to avoid snoring spouses, political gossip, or the wandering feet of toddlers. Kings often had their own bedchambers, even when married, because apparently sovereignty includes vetoing elbows in the ribs. And yet, even these rooms weren't truly solo. Servants might sleep on the floor. Guards stood outside. A dog lurked in the corner, shedding aristocratically. Complete solitude? Rare. Possibly dangerous. Definitely unusual. Historians still argue over how common solitary sleep truly was. Some think it was more widespread than records suggest. Others believe that the cultural weight of group sleep was too strong to ignore. One thing's clear. Medieval folks didn't view the bed as a space of independence. It was a space of community, of witnessed existence. And maybe that's what made being alone at night so unsettling. Not the darkness, not the cold, but the lack of a witness. If something happened, if a dream turned sour, if a breath caught in your throat, if the devil came knocking, who would see? Who would help? Who would believe you? So tonight, as you stretch out in your private bed, with your weighted blanket, your scented candle, and absolutely no livestock in sight, spare a thought for your medieval counterpart. They didn't sleep alone, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't dare. You settle into bed, your head nestled into a pillow, your body finally relaxing as you stretch out flat, arms at your side, ready to drift into the soft oblivion of sleep. Except if you'd done that in the Middle Ages, someone might gasp or whisper or rush to prop you up because lying flat on your back to sleep. That looked a little too much like you were already dead. Welcome to the world of the upright sleeper, where posture in bed wasn't just about comfort. It was about health, superstition, and sometimes even fooling death itself. Let's start with the practical. Many medieval people slept partially upright, their backs propped against a wall, a headboard, or sometimes a bundle of straw or cloth piled behind them like a makeshift throne. And they did this not because it felt amazing, but because it was believed to be safer. Why? Because lying completely flat was associated with corpses. The dead were laid out supine, hands folded, feet together, eyes closed. It was the position of repose, the pose they'd eventually be buried in. So, for the superstitious, and that meant almost everyone, sleeping in the same posture as a dead person was seen as tempting fate. Better to angle your body, raise your head, keep yourself in a position that looked more alive. Just in case death was confused and needed a visual cue. But there was another reason too, and it came from the realm of medieval medicine. Humor theory. According to this now defunct medical system, the human body was ruled by 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Imbalances caused illness, and what was one of the worst things you could do to those fragile humors? Let them pool, especially in your head. Lying flat while you slept was believed to let phlegm build up, clogging the brain and lungs. That, in turn, could lead to headaches, congestion, bad dreams, or even death. Upright sleeping helped gravity do its job, draining the body downward and keeping the vapors from rising to your head, and planting sinful thoughts or night terrors. One 14th century physician even warned that sleeping flat could cause the drowning of the chest in its own moistures, which sounds less like a diagnosis and more like the opening line of a really dramatic plague poem. So, what did this look like in practice? Beds, especially among the wealthy, were often designed with angled headboards or wedge-shaped pillows. Some people arranged themselves against piles of bolsters, adjusting throughout the night to stay semi-reclined. Poorer folks might sleep sitting up against a wall or even on a bench, with a cloak wrapped around their body like a burrito of desperation. And if you've ever tried to sleep in a chair during a long layover at an airport, you'll understand. It wasn't comfortable, but it was habit. And habit, especially in the medieval world, was often tangled with survival. Now, let's get weird. There are stories, especially among more superstitious households, of people deliberately sleeping as upright as possible, sometimes with their feet still on the floor. Why? Because some believed that as long as you didn't fully recline, death wouldn't count you among the sleeping dead. It was like playing hide and seek with mortality. If your body didn't resemble a corpse, maybe the Grim Reaper would just keep walking. Nothing to see here. Just a very tired man in a chair. Of course, not everyone followed this rule. In monasteries, for instance, sleeping postures varied. Some monks were allowed to lie flat, usually those in poor health or old age. Others followed stricter codes and slept sitting upright, hands crossed over their robes, as if preparing for the final judgment in real time. This made falling asleep harder, But it also made waking up for night prayers easier. You're already halfway vertical. Just add sandals and regret. Even outside the monastery, posture carried meaning. A noblewoman reclining too deeply might be scolded for inviting impure dreams. A laborer flat on his back after a feast might be accused of gluttony or sloth. In a world without orthopedic mattresses, your sleep position could reveal your soul's alignment. And yes, people wrote about this. Medical texts from the 12th to 15th centuries give detailed instructions for ideal sleep posture. Lie on your right side to aid digestion. Don't curl too tight. Bad for the lungs. Or use your folded cloak like a lumpy cushion of faith. Because death visited often. And sleep? Sleep was a rehearsal. And if you were lucky enough to wake up the next morning, slightly sore but alive, you had proof that once again, you had fooled the night. You scratch your arm. It's dark. You're half asleep, and you think maybe it's just the rough wool of your blanket or the straw poking through your mattress. But then the itch returns. Your neck, your back, your ankles. Something tiny. Something hungry. Welcome to the real terrors of medieval sleep. The bugs. The bites. The bloodsuckers that turned every bed into a battlefield. Because while the night might have felt spiritually dangerous, filled with demons, dreams, and divine judgment, it was also literally crawling with creatures you couldn't pray away. Fleas, lice, mites, and bedbugs, each more persistent than the last, each treating your body like a tavern with free ale and no closing time. Let's start with the obvious. Hygiene was limited. Not absent, just vastly different from what we'd expect. People did wash, but soap was harsh, baths were infrequent, especially in winter, and hair? Well, it was often left to its own ecosystem. Which meant lice, those tiny, tireless scalp dwellers, were practically part of the family. Entire households lived with lice. Children, parents, clergy, comb them out in the morning, say a prayer, and carry on. There were even special lice combs made from bone or wood, like medieval grooming tools for tiny vampires. And then came the fleas. If you lived with animals, and most people did, fleas were inevitable. Dogs had them, cats had them. Pigs were mobile flea hotels. Even your best wool blanket, lovingly stitched by your grandmother, probably had a thriving flea metropolis in the folds. They didn't just bite, they leapt, they hid, they infested. You didn't sleep through them so much as learn to ignore the madness. Fleas weren't just annoying, they were deadly. Their bites weren't poisonous, but they carried a little-known tag-along, Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the Black Death. That's right. These tiny leaping parasites helped wipe out half of Europe. And you could be cuddled up with them every single night. Then there were bedbugs, which modern science confirms are basically the embodiment of hatred with legs. They hide in crevices during the day, mattress seams, bed frames, wall cracks, and emerge at night like vampires in search of the buffet. Medieval beds were ideal for them. Wooden frames with plenty of nooks, straw mattresses that never saw sunlight, and hosts who slept in the same clothes for days. Bedbugs aren't picky. They bite, they feed, they vanish, and they leave behind stains, itching, and insomnia. There are medieval texts, yes, actual writings, that describe bedbug infestations. One French chronicler described a guest refusing to stay the night in a certain noble house because the wooden bed creaked not from age, but from the biting swarm within. And that's one of the nicer descriptions. Mites were another problem. Invisible to the naked eye, they lived in blankets, furs, and dirty linens. They caused rashes, skin infections, and endless scratching. Some people thought they were caused by sin. Others blamed humors. Either way, the only solution seemed to be scratch more and accept your fate. So what did people do? They fought back in weird and creative ways. Some burned herbs like rosemary or mint near the bed to drive insects away. Others stuffed mattresses with dried lavender, wormwood, or camphor, hoping the scent would repel bugs. Aristocrats might sprinkle their sheets with rosewater or vinegar, which at best made them smell slightly sour while still hosting a thriving insect circus underneath. Boiling linens was one of the more effective strategies, if you had the firewood, the pot, and the stamina to haul boiling water. Otherwise, you might leave your sheets in the sun, beat them with sticks, or pray the lice got bored and moved on to the neighbor. Some even adopted bedbug rituals. You weren't expected to have a bug-free bed. That was fantasy. But you might draw protective symbols over your door, sprinkle blessed salt beneath your mattress, or sleep with a relic under your pillow in hopes that the saints would smite the mites. There were superstitions too. Sleeping near garlic was believed to repel both bugs and spirits. Iron nails hidden in the bed frame might deter crawling pests, or at least give you something to curse when you rolled onto them in the night. And yet, despite all this, people slept. They still curled up next to one another, whispered their prayers, adjusted their straw, and braced themselves for another long night of battling the unseen. Because what choice did they have? Beds were expensive. Mattresses were rare. Many people slept directly on reeds, rushes, or straw, which might be changed once a season, maybe. These piles weren't cleaned. They were turned over, fluffed, perhaps sprinkled with ashes or herbs. But they still harbored a teeming jungle of parasites, many of which considered you a walking buffet. And it wasn't just poor folk. Rich households had bugs too. Bigger beds, heavier curtains, more furs and silks and feather pillows, all of which made for excellent bug hotels. One noblewoman reportedly had to flee her guest chamber in the middle of the night, not because of an assassin or ghost, but because her feather bed was alive with lice. Some folks slept with sleeping caps not just for warmth, but to protect their scalps from lice. Others wrapped their feet in cloth. A few even wore gloves to bed, not for fashion, but for defense. It's easy to laugh now. We have bug sprays, laundry, hot showers, but the medieval sleeper had none of those things. Just instinct, superstition, and an iron will forged by decades of bedtime itching. So tonight, when you slip between clean sheets, maybe pause and thank the gods of soap, bleach, and pest control. Because once upon a time, every night was a gamble. Not just with dreams or demons, but with whatever tiny army had claimed your pillow as its fortress. Sleep tight. Don't let this... Well, you know, it begins innocently enough. You're fast asleep, nestled in your usual spot. Maybe between a sibling and a goat, maybe alone on a hard straw mat. The fire is low. Outside, the wind howls softly, but inside, your body moves. Not a twitch, not a stretch. You rise, eyes closed, arms slack. Feet shuffle across the dirt floor as though guided by some silent melody only you can hear. You don't speak. You don't think. You simply walk. In today's world, we'd call it sleepwalking. A benign curiosity, maybe even a party anecdote. But in the Middle Ages, it was terrifying, and possibly a sign that you were possessed. Because in a time when science and superstition walked hand in hand, sleepwalking wasn't a harmless quirk. It was a spiritual event, and often a very bad one. The medieval mind didn't separate the body and soul the way modern thinkers do. If your body moved without your conscious control, then something else, someone else, must be guiding it. And that someone wasn't often friendly. There were a few interpretations, and none of them comforting. Some believed sleepwalkers were victims of demonic influence. Their souls, weakened by sin or bad dreams, had slipped from the body during sleep, allowing a lesser demon, or even the devil himself, to take the wheel. You weren't dreaming. You were being driven. Others believed the opposite, that your soul had gone wandering, as many believed it did during sleep, and what remained in your body was an empty shell, vulnerable to mischief, spirits, or worse. That's why sleepwalkers were sometimes treated with extreme caution. People were afraid to wake them, not because of trauma or safety, but because it was considered dangerous to disturb someone in the grip of supernatural forces. You might trap the soul outside the body, or worse, you might invite whatever was inside to notice you. And if a sleepwalker spoke, things got really scary. There are medieval accounts of people sleep-talking in unknown languages, of uttering prophecies or blasphemies, of naming dead relatives or reciting secrets no one had told them. Some monks recorded these incidents in their chronicles as signs of possession or divine warning or mental illness, though they wouldn't have used that phrase. Most ordinary people had no concept of neurology. They didn't know about parasomnias or REM cycles, but they understood fear. And when Cousin Ethel wandered outside in her nightgown and stood on the well whispering, "He is coming," at 2 a.m., no one said, "She's sleep-deprived." They said, "She's cursed." In towns and villages, sleepwalkers were occasionally brought before the local priest. Not for healing, there was no medicine for this, but for blessing, confession, and sometimes exorcism. Holy water might be sprinkled on their bedding, prayers said over their sleeping body, and if the walking persisted, people started locking doors, not to keep danger out, but to keep the danger in. The line between the spiritual and physical was blurry at night. Shadows lengthened, thoughts twisted. Sleep was already considered dangerous, a time when dreams could tempt you, demons could visit, and your soul might drift off course. Add unconscious movement into the mix, and you had a recipe for moral panic. Of course, not every case of sleepwalking inspired terror. In monasteries where dreams were often considered messages from God, a sleepwalking monk might be viewed with a mix of awe and anxiety. Was he being called by the divine? Or was he straying from the path? Was that midnight stroll across the cloister a sign of holy restlessness or unconfessed sin? Some saints, like Saint Christina the Astonishing, were said to have performed miraculous feats while in trance-like states, floating, climbing trees, walking into fires unharmed. Her behavior might seem terrifying to a modern observer, but in the medieval mind, it was proof of divine touch, strange though it may be. And yet, even among holy figures, there was an edge of fear. Because the body, once untethered from the waking mind, was unpredictable. And in a world built on control, ritual, and divine order, unpredictability was rarely seen as holy. In some households, sleepwalkers were restrained. Not cruelly, just practically. A sibling might tie a cord to your ankle. Parents might block the doorway with furniture. Some folks even used bells or charms to alert them if a loved one stirred after midnight. And yes, there were folk remedies. Sleepwalkers might be asked to sleep with a Bible under their pillow, or wear a rosary like a necklace, or have a sprig of St. John's wort sewn into their nightclothes. It was all about protection, not punishment, because even when sleepwalkers frightened others, there was also pity. It wasn't their fault. They were vulnerable vessels caught between realms, and it wasn't just walking. Sleep-talking, thrashing, even laughing in your sleep. These all carried their own set of meanings. A child who laughed loudly while asleep might be said to be visited by fairies. A woman who cried might be mourning something yet to happen. Sleep wasn't a passive act. It was a window, a leak in the soul. So tonight, as you lie down in your soft, sealed-off room, maybe with white noise playing and a weighted blanket pressing you toward dreamland, remember what medieval folks knew. Sleep isn't always silent, and the body doesn't always rest. Sometimes it remembers old griefs. Sometimes it answers calls you didn't hear. And sometimes it rises and walks, and no one knows why. But in the Middle Ages, they knew one thing for sure. If you sleepwalked often, you weren't just a restless sleeper. You were a mystery, and maybe a warning.